Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Today is Wednesday, August 21st. I'm Nathan Kiker.
And I'm George Bogdan.
Our guest today is Toby Muse. Toby is a journalist and documentary filmmaker. He is also the author of Kilo, Inside the Deadliest Cocaine Cartels, From the Jungles to the Streets. Before we dive into our interview, let's take a look at the news of the day.
Democrats are in Chicago to nominate Vice President Kamala Harris for president, with speeches from party elders, leaders, and elected officials. On Monday, President Biden gave an impassioned speech in support of Harris.
In Asia, tensions are escalating in the South China Sea, bringing confrontations with Beijing closer to a key U.S. ally. Early Monday morning, between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. local time, at least 3 collisions occurred between Coast Guard vessels from China and the Philippines. These events mark a significant escalation in tensions that have been brewing over the past 18 months.
In Europe, despite Kiev's reported successes in its 2-week-old incursion into Russia, Moscow's forces continue to advance steadily into eastern Ukraine, threatening a critical logistical hub. Officials in the eastern Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk are evacuating residents in anticipation of a possible fall to the Russian advance, which is now less than 6 miles from the city's limits.
The German government is facing criticism from politicians across the political spectrum after it was revealed that Finance Minister Christian Lindner wrote to colleagues vetoing new military aid for Ukraine. In a letter sent to the Ministry of Defense and Foreign Office on August 5th, Lindner stated that his ministry would reject any new applications for military support unless additional funding could be secured, suggesting frozen Russian assets in Europe as a possible source. With that, let's dive into our interview with Toby Muse. Toby, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
So, how does the cocaine trade differ from other drug trades?
Well, that's a good question. The cocaine trade has really been focused in 3 countries in its history. That's Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. And what we've seen there over the past 50 years or so is the rise of these huge cocaine cartels that have sought to really have massive sway in their country. And what they do that is by taking over territory, but also massive power to bribe authorities, to corrupt institutions, and to employ hundreds, if not thousands, of people who will work directly with these cocaine cartels. Cocaine certainly has been one of the major focuses of American anti-drug policy in, say, Latin America in the past 20, 30 years, I would say. I would say there might be an interesting change that we are seeing with the DEA responding to the Drug Enforcement Agency, responding to complaints and demands from local politicians here in the United States to start taking a focus somehow away from cocaine and more towards things like fentanyl. And that would be because of the massive, savage overdose toll we are seeing within the United States due to fentanyl more than anything else.
Interesting. One thing that really caught us about your book, which we loved, and as someone who's writing a book myself, I was fascinated to kind of see how you got all these folks who are kind of involved in an illicit trade to go on the record. And so do you have any particular methodology, or was it just kind of soaking in their world? And how'd you do that?
Yeah, spend about 15 years hanging out with them, drinking beers with them, going out partying with them. That's essentially how I did it. I have and had more friends in the underworld on the social side. And what I really wanted to show was this ecology, this ecosystem of the underworld and how it all relates to itself. My friends were involved in organizing the parties. Now, what I wanted to bring out is that the social scene is central to the underworld. When these young men dream of becoming the next Tony Montana, the next Pablo Escobar, they do it because they want money and they want women. I mean, that's part of this thing, the cocaine trade. And again, another reason for writing this book was to show it doesn't run on pie charts or graphs or statistics. It runs on the darkest emotions possible. That's lust, greed, treachery, savagery. That's what cocaine runs on. So I think going through that, I was able to see a lot of the core motivators. I was able to meet these drug traffickers, meet these killers for hire through the social scene, through the parties, which in itself is a wild part of this intense social scene where these parties can go on for 2 or 3 days. It's really this kind of devil's dance where they just sniff as much drugs as they can. There's models there, there's actresses there. And this is where the drug trafficker gets to show off to the other drug traffickers. He gets to show off his watch, his girlfriend. That's what this industry is about. And I felt in recent publications, the way we were talking about drugs industry, that part wasn't coming across. We were too concentrated on the money or the number of kilos seized at the Mexican border. This is about emotion.
So you do a very holistic approach, starting with the people who actually pick the cocoa leaves, all the way up to the cartel leaders, the drug runners, and a lot of people like the Coast Guard and the DEA who try to enforce the laws on the books. I start at the bottom. Tell us about some of these cocoa growers. Obviously, they're probably inspired and often are inspired by economic hardship, but give us a little bit more illumination around their lives and what leads them to start growing the product.
So a country like Colombia, where they grow coca in Peru or Bolivia, you have to understand how isolated these places are. I don't think people do get quite how abandoned they are by the rest of Colombian society. And I'll give you an example. The place I chose to demonstrate this, where I hung out with the coca farmers, this was in a place called Catatumbo, which is on the border with Venezuela. And that actually means the land of lightning. So there are more lightning strikes in Catatumbo than anywhere else on the planet. So every night was like the biggest thunderstorm of my life, repeated every single night, with the lightning coming straight down on me in this kind of tiny little wooden hut. But these people were so abandoned that they had set up a toll for this dirt track that went through the little hamlet. And you had to pay, 50 cents to go. If you were doing any sort of commerce along this dirt track, you would pay 50 cents to use this dirt track. You were carrying, for instance, coca paste, or you were carrying gasoline to take to your farm to produce coca paste, which is the first step in producing cocaine. It's changing the coca crop, coca leaves, into this paste that will then become cocaine. With that toll money, it took them 4 years, I think they told me, to raise money to pay for the school. Cocaine is literally paying for the school in parts of Colombia. And the question you always have is, where the hell is the central government? Where is the local government? If the central government will not do its job, other people will step in to do it. And I think that's the first thing to understand about these coca farmers. They often live in places where there's no infrastructure. Infrastructure is a big word. We use that all the time. It just means a decent road. It means a bridge. It means a school, and it means a health clinic. And these people have none of that. So if you're going to grow, let's say, a ton of pineapples, what are you going to do with a ton of pineapples when the only available transport, because in the dirt track, is either a motorbike or most likely a mule? So what can you do with a ton of, by the time you've paid to get it to market, you've lost money. Now, if you just make 1 kilo of coca, it's the size of this. I'm holding up a book. That's it. You do that 5-6 times a year. Their harvests are incredible now because of how they've a genetic modification of, the advances in the coca crop itself. They're getting harvests of 6, 7, 8 every year. That's also because of how lush and tropical Colombia is.
So in your book, you hit on this, and then I read a book several years ago, Narcoeconomics by Tom Wainwright, who hits on it as well. The U.S. is obsessed with getting rid of these cocoa fields, but that doesn't seem to stop people from producing it. How can we get governments in South America away from growing cocoa, which produces cocaine?
Well, there was a really interesting experiment done as part of the peace process, which I touch on in my book, which is the Colombian government had a peace process in 2016 with the largest guerrilla group called the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Everybody who had thought for 1 second about the future of Colombia understood that Colombia will never know peace as long as there is the vibrant cocaine trade. The cocaine trade and peace are automatically on the other side. It's just not possible. So as part of the peace process, it was, well, how will we solve the drug problem? And they had this pilot program in a place called Briseño. And it was this really interesting process, because I went there after the peace process, and I spoke to the coca farmers there, and they said that they had felt that they had been ripped off by the government a number of times, and it took them considerable amount of convincing for them to agree to be a pilot program where they would take subsidies, stipends from the government in order to rip out all of their coca, and within a 2-year time they would get money to set up their next business. That could be growing chickens, running cows, or bringing up cows, coffee. And what happened was all of these farmers basically collectively, proudly said, yes, we will be the pilot program to show Colombia the way forward. They all ripped out their coca. And they said how hard that process was, because coca is a lazy man's crop. That's the joke about it. You just go out, you fumigate it a little bit, but you don't actually have to do anything. You then just turn it into coca paste, but it's not like coffee where you're constantly looking at the coffee beans. No, it's just lazy. You leave it out there, it will grow and just fumigate it. And so it was hard for them to learn how to become farmers again. This is what they told me. It was hard to learn how to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, go out, feed the cows, go milk the cows, whatever it was. But they did it, and they did it proudly. And the first year, everything was great. They received their monthly stipend from the government. And then the problem started to happen. The bureaucracy, the major payments that was actually going to help them set up their next business didn't come through in a lot of cases. Then there was corruption. A lot of them can't read or write. So things were signed on their behalf in the local mayor's office. Contractors were brought in that they were signed, and they complained about rampant corruption. So in the end, when I went there, all of these farmers were deeply, deeply disenchanted with the government. They had lost all hope in this. They were deeply resentful. And many of them were saying, the first opportunity I get, I'm going back to coca. So the way to get the farmer away from coca, I think if we can come up with a plan, something like that, stipends, offering them a chance to invest in their farms, to give them a new way to make money, and to make sure corruption doesn't steal that money. Now, these are huge things. I don't mean to minimize it, because trying to keep control of corruption in a place like Colombia, Peru, or Bolivia is extremely difficult. But the one piece of good news is these farmers are tired of coca. They are tired of coca. When I first started reporting on coca, they were making good amounts of money. And they were living through the first golden age of coca. Everything was just great. Now they've gone a whole generation. They know that coca brings them nothing but social decay, violence to their towns, and the money's not even that great anymore. At the moment, in fact, there's a problem in many parts of Colombia. They can't sell the coca. There's a surplus of production. So these farmers are tired of it. They are waiting for someone to come in. Now, there is a new government, Gustavo Petro, who has pledged to absolutely work with the coca farmers. You know, he said he wants to take away these police raids where they sent police in to rip out the coca from the farmers. He wants to work more with the farmers. But he needs the international community to help him, and it's not sure if he's quite got that yet. That's still something. We're halfway through his government, so we're still trying to see what that's going to look like.
Fascinating. The United States both kind of dominates the Western Hemisphere and, creates this space for middle income economies. And I've always wondered, as the government talks about these kind of strident interventions to try to stop the drug trade, whether, there are kind of unseen mechanisms that are supporting it. Would you say that's the case? And if so, what has to change in order for that to evolve?
In what sense? I don't understand the question. What unseen things?
Well, sort of the United States is this sort of peerless, sort of powerful country in the Western Hemisphere. And in some ways, it thinks of itself either explicitly or implicitly as calling the shots on what happens on that half of the world. And so, some people say that Latin America really enjoys a great deal of economic relative economic prosperity to the rest of the world, given that kind of environment. But I wonder whether there's a case to be made that that kind of stability actually has kind of enhance this drug trade or allows it to continue or nurtures it. And if I'm totally wrong, I completely understand, but I just wondered about that.
No, certainly. I mean, a broader thing on the American influence, I think, certainly if you look at a place like Colombia, it's American consumption of drugs, almost matched by Europeans, but American consumption of drugs, which is causing the chaos in these countries, I think. I think it is this decision by consumers in the first world, certainly, that does cause so much of the problem. So America certainly provides hundreds of millions of dollars in aid in order to create a problem its consumers are helping to create. So there is this kind of push and pull between the two. Certainly the US has dictated drug policy, I think, across the region. And certainly a government like Gustavo Petro's wants to change that. It's just, can Gustavo Petro find support across the world to join him in changing drug policy? And it looks at the moment as if the world is certainly siding more with the United States about a continuation of the war on drugs, roughly in the way we've seen it over the past 50 years, rather than a complete break, which would be what he would urge, to sort of some form of up to possible legalization of cocaine. Now, I'm not sure if Gustavo Petro wants to go that far, but he's certainly looking on that track somewhere along that decriminalization. Again, it's an open debate, but it also feels like if this decision on the war on drugs, there is no better time, certainly for Colombia, to make this. There's not likely to ever be a president in the short term who's as focused on trying to end the war on drugs as Petro. He spoke about it in his inaugural speech. This is central to his government. And it's central to the Colombian experience of the past 30 years. The war on drugs is to be part of Colombia. It's not a sideline, like I think it can be in the United States or in England. It is the centrality of their existence, that it just, no one escapes the impact of these cartels. You either, you suffer them, or you work for them, or you're a victim of them, or, they corrupt your local institutions. You can't escape it in a place like Colombia.
Talk a bit more about his reforms and what he's proposing. You, in your book, mentioned his efforts to decriminalize or legalize. What else is he trying to do? But then specifically, how is he trying to stop the folks who get into the trade earlier, those who you mentioned do it for the watches and the girls and the money and the prestige? Like, how is he trying to combat this, and what makes him different from previous leaders?
So I think the big one is it's this taking, in the past, it was the easiest thing. When you read these books about Vietnam, it was always that you could just go on a base and just jump on a helicopter, and the Americans would carry you to wherever that helicopter was going. Some years ago, it was almost that easy just to get on a helicopter and just go see the police ripping out coca crops in different parts of the country. That was the way they saw their job. It was to diminish the supply. That was their attack. Now the government of Gustavo Petro, because his policies really revolve around trying to help the small farmer, help the most impoverished of the country. He said he wants to use this police force, and there is evidence, to really go after the cartels themselves. He wants to see much more catching drugs. Rather than destroying coca crops, he wants to see the police decommissioning tons of cocaine. So they've been very proud about the amount that they're decommissioning of the drugs. Regarding how stopping people getting into it, I think there's going to be there's been a push to sort of increase the infrastructure again in the countryside, to increase access to education, to increase access to health. So there's not that sense of desperation in the Colombian countryside that would push young men and women towards this business. When you get to the young men who are after the women and the money and the prestige and the respect, it may be too late. I don't know what you can do. When you're dealing with a 17-year-old who's already mentally on that track, I don't know what you can do. That person's probably far down this line. And there are interesting there are interesting analyses of what all of this means for Colombia. For instance, if you were to, we have at the moment, the largest cartel is one called the Gulf Clan. And the government has been sort of toing and froing about whether it should negotiate or not with the Gulf Clan. This is important because the Colombians have basically had a rule that they do not negotiate with criminal organizations. So every organization in the past has had some veneer of a political front. The biggest would be the Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, the AUC. That was the far-right paramilitary organization. The top of it was made up of drug traffickers, but the organization undeniably had politics. It had a political stance. The Gulf Clan may or may not have that political stance, because the long-term gain of the Colombian traffickers over the past 30 years is to pretend to have a political veneer in order for the government to then sit down and negotiate with them. So the Gulf Clan is trying to set up this negotiation with the government. But someone wrote an interesting column saying, okay, but what would happen if, let's just say, of all of the 9,000 members, I'm making up a number, of the Gulf Clan immediately left all of their illegal jobs tomorrow? We're going to create a new vacuum. How does Colombia break out of this cycle? That I don't know if anyone has the answer. It's a generational thing of changing culture, because we've seen what happens. The peace process I referenced earlier with the FARC in 2016 created one huge vacuum. So we went from one or two, possibly, let's say, three major guerrilla groups in Colombia in 2016, the FARC, the ELN, the EPL. Now no one knows how many are out there. If you just go down to the border with Ecuador, there's probably 2 or 3 or 4 that have all been created since that peace process. So Colombia has to break this cycle of getting people to demobilize, getting people out of one criminal organization, and then not creating a vacuum. One part of this, again, is going to be, and I would urge us to think about this because I don't see us thinking about this, is to lower the demand in our own countries. And the reason I bring this up is because the only time I remember of people seriously trying to at least put demand front and center was that doomed campaign of Nancy Reagan, just say no, that everybody rightly made jokes about. But why? Where is the person who's standing up in England and saying, why is London one of the cities that most consumes cocaine on the planet? Why is the American population one? What level of alienation are we going through that we're self-medicating with these drugs? I would love to see that conversation. Why do we consume drugs more than the Dutch? That was the famous thing when I was growing up. English people would go to Holland to smoke weed in the coffee shops, and the Dutch said, no, thanks. Well, I think this is an interesting philosophical question about where we are in 2024, and I don't see anyone really touching it. And that, by the way, obviously, if the demand for cocaine goes down, the cartels are not going to keep on making something that no one wants to buy. Now, I don't want to minimize internal consumption in Colombia either, or around the rest of Latin America, but they make the big amount of money by getting it to the United States, by getting it to Europe. So we are absolutely complicit in this trade as a people.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of what you're saying resonates with me. I was living in the UK, actually throughout the Brexit debate and then up through the vote. And, I was in my department at Oxford and no one could possibly believe, that the UK would leave. And of course, as someone from outside the country, I was listening to people who are not, in elite institutions talk about, the sense of despair they felt. And, on that point, the United States government is pretty fixated on fentanyl. And I wonder whether, there's all these stories coming out and it seems very anecdotal, but of people, trying to snort cocaine and then accidentally, ingesting a really deadly dose of fentanyl. And so I wonder whether you think that kind of intermixing or, kind of evolving threat of drug overdose is going to kind of impact consumption, or whether that's just not going to even dent it.
I'm going to be curious to see. I'm still waiting to see the results of this, and I think it's an excellent question. There's the old joke that Karl Marx had about capitalism being its own gravedigger, and them dealers mixing fentanyl with cocaine is a perfect example of this. Again, one thing I think a lot of people do not understand about cocaine, how inherently it is recreational. The opioid addiction seems to be an extremely tough addiction to overcome. The majority of people who use cocaine use it recreationally and don't seem to have that many problems. It's just a fact. We can see in terms of the number of overdoses compared to the opioids. We can see in terms of, I'm talking about powder cocaine. I think crack cocaine is noticeably different. But in terms of the amount of people checking in for rehabilitation, the numbers between cocaine and the opioids are just nowhere near that. So the problem they have is if they keep screwing around and keep trying to save money in a place like New York City, this New York Wall Street dealer is just going to say, screw it. I'm just going to do MDMA. I'm going to do 2CB, which is the drug that the Colombians made popular again. All of these other synthetic drugs where I can just be sure that, or hope that I can be sure that fentanyl is not involved. People do not need to do cocaine. And now we are seeing that certain, I think some of the Mexican organizations are pulling back from trying to mix cocaine with fentanyl because, again, people just don't need to put up with that. And as I say, I'm curious to see what impact this is going to have in places like London, in places like New York City, because we've had some heartbreaking stories. I don't know if you saw that Wall Street Journal story that came out either last year or the year before about one dealer. And it was just a collection of and how he had sold to like 5 or 6 different sets of people. And it was fascinating to show how widespread cocaine use is now in these major cities, because one of them's like a elementary school teacher, if I'm not wrong. One's a corporate lawyer. One's a Wall Street bro or something like this, someone in between. And it's these heartbreaking things of once he realizes what's happened, he's sending these text messages. Hey, just checking in. Sounds like this one's a bit strong. LOL, please take it easy. The person was already dead. Hey, checking in, and he starts realizing, and it's just heartbreaking. And these people just never had a chance. They just wanted a fun Friday night on, buying cocaine. All right. They don't need to die for that. Whatever your feelings about drug use. And yeah, they're dead, 27, 34, people with entire lives ahead of them. It's tragic, I think. And that's what the black, sorry, just a final thought, because I don't want to blame the consumer only on this. This is what the black market does as well. The black market pushes all of this into an unregulated zone that is beyond regulation. So I don't have, if we get around to it, I'm agnostic about what legalization would look like. I don't know. I don't think the rollout of cannabis has been particularly great in America. Again, we can talk about this. I'm not an expert, but it hasn't been exactly heartening to walk around Washington, D.C. and every single street corner stinks of weed, because the implicit deal of that was the argument for legalization, which is a respectable one, is treat people like adults. They will act like adults. When it's like, all right, we're going to partially legalize whatever, the marijuana in DC is a very strange situation because of, I think, people in Maryland have a voice in it and they can block it or something. So it hasn't been fully legalized, but there are stores where you can walk in and get it. But then immediately just to go out, I'm seeing people like obviously driving high on marijuana. It's not been our finest moment, I would say. And I think anyone who's honest has to say, all right, what does that mean for a future talk about legalization? But the black market, because of the war on drugs, does so much damage. It does so much damage. And the major thing, one thing I would want people to take from this book is the black market takes monsters, Al Capone, Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, and turns them into millionaires, if not billionaires. These are not impressive men. They are violent. They are ruthless. They are merciless. That's what the black market encourages and rewards. If you took away prohibition, Al Capone was going to be some thug standing on a street corner in Chicago, extorting the grandfather and grandmother old store in front of him, probably beating around 4 prostitutes he ran. That was going to be Al Capone's life. But once we gave him prohibition, he became an international figure. The same with Pablo Escobar. He was stealing gravestones. He was stealing cars and gravestones. We gave him the black market. This is, and so that's one lesson I want to, that was a little bit of a rant because I just remembered how much damage the black market does.
No, and I know George has something else, but I would say it is shocking when you really start to open your eyes to it, how much cocaine is everywhere. In DC especially. Where are
we're
you
in
at?
the golden age. So I'm just outside of DC. I now live in Arlington, Virginia.
Yeah, so I'm sitting in
but I've been here for a
Alexandria.
few.
I'm sitting in Alexandria right now. We could have done it in person, but I was going to say, it's wild. If I go to a bar tonight and wanted to buy cocaine, I could have it in 30 minutes. Everyone knows the dealer and everyone knows where to get it if they want it. So I think a lot of people are sort of blind to the presence that it is everywhere. And it's not just in fraternities and SEC schools anymore. It's people who, to your point, work at big law firms who make $250,000 a year. It's ubiquitous, but I don't want to take away from George's time. I know he had a question as well.
Oh, well, no, I mean, I would just say that, I think it's one of the remarkable things about the topic that you've spent so much time on is that it cuts across all sorts of barriers in society. I mean, I think, we're all separated by only a few degrees from someone who's really struggling, with a terrible addiction like that to cocaine. But I mean, on the larger point, I wonder whether you think, The Guardian called this year the Super Bowl for democracy. And it seems like it's going to culminate with the U.S. election, and whether you've seen any really significant, policy changes, or if you anticipate any significant policy changes given these kind of electoral cycles that are going to impact this trade.
As I say, I think the institution of drug policy is going to move away from Colombia. And I think Colombia, certainly the armed forces have become dependent on this American money. It's just been there for an entire generation since Plan Colombia, which was this bilateral, this bipartisan plan to shore up the Colombian government as it was fighting both the cartels and this rebel insurgency. It was hatched under Bill Clinton, but really comes to fruition under George W. Bush. Seamless, again, when these bipartisan policies existed. And we've had 25 years of that. And I think, if there's one thing, certainly living in Washington, D.C., I think this city needs a bit more of is accountability. All right, let's have accountability on Plan Colombia. And the accountability is, after 25 years of this plan, of this attacking the drugs, there's more cocaine than ever before. And I don't think people understand that. They think it was back in the 80s. They think it was with Pablo Escobar. No, it's right now. There is more cocaine than ever before. It's more widespread, as we just touched on. Anybody can get it in 30 minutes. So I think the Colombians have absolutely become dependent upon U.S. aid to fight the insurgencies and to fight these cartels. If the U.S. gets bored of that because of this staggering number of overdoses we're seeing due to fentanyl, I think the last total number of overdoses was something like 110,000, I think, right, for 2022, if I'm not wrong. That's more than all of the soldiers. I think that's close to double all the soldiers who died in Vietnam. And we just did that in 1 year. I think that is coarsening and hardening our politics. I think there's a sense of desperation, a sense of frustration, and a sense of impotence here in the United States. And I think this is when the US I think people are going to lash out because of their frustration, because they don't see any hope on the horizon. I think if Trump gets in, I would not be surprised at all if we start seeing those raids that took out people like Osama bin Laden on drug cartel heads in places like Mexico. That would violate over a century's understanding of sovereignty. These are huge, huge issues at stake. But I just don't think the US believes at its core that the Mexican government is an honest partner when it comes to this. I mean, we've seen images of when the Mexican police have arrested, or authorities, I can't remember if it was the police or the army or the Marines, have arrested some senior cartel person only to have to give them back because they weren't able to get them out of somewhere like Culiacan or so. And then what that happens, I don't know. Now, will Trump, go that far? That would be my suspicion. And already look at this last deal that we're looking with El Mayo. And the Mexicans are furious about this because they believe that a plan was set in motion in Mexican territory that the US authorities knew about and hatched without consulting them. But in the end, it ended up with the capture of this elusive drug trafficker who had been on the run for decades. And, having been to a place like Culiacan in Sinaloa, everyone knows how things operate there. I mean, it's not a secret. It's not a mystery that they are the power behind the throne. And they're not even the power behind the throne. Sorry, they pull the strings. That you don't just defy the cartel leaders. You don't defy a cartel in Culiacan. You don't say, I'm going to make putting Los Chapitos out of business my number one thing and expect to live to see New Year. It just doesn't work that way. So I think with Harris, if Harris is the one who gets in, I don't know. I just haven't seen that drug. It just doesn't seem to be at the top of her priorities. I don't know what she would do, to be honest. One other thing I would say that I think as we as we move towards a new drug policy, my whole life I've been wary of the racket. And the racket for me has been this massive bureaucracy that was unaccountable in the form of, the police, the DEA, that was just carrying on this war on drugs without ever really showing results. It always seemed to be, all right, we haven't won the war on drugs, but just give me a little bit more war on drugs and next time I'll win it. The definition of insanity, we keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result, right? That old cliche. But for now, watching this rollout of the massive corporations that are going to start getting involved in the rollout of legal marijuana, I think the racket might now be on that side. And I'm very cautious. I hear about these spas in Manhattan, ketamine spas. You cannot be giving ketamine to just any old person. This is just not going to work. But there's money involved on that side. There seems to be an ease up of policing on this. And this is starting to make me worried a little bit. It's still taking shape, but I see something there that I think the money is going to be there. The police are focused on other things. We could end up with bad things. Where's the research being done on constant consumption of highly potent marijuana? There's some suggestion in some parts that it could potentially be responsible for psychological problems.
Schizophrenia.
Where's the research being done? Exactly.
Sam
These
Quinones,
are questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sam Quinones wrote Dreamland and The Least of Us, and he was on a few months ago, and he talked about the rise of, when you look at the legalization and decriminalization of marijuana, all the other effects that came with it. It's not the marijuana from the 70s. It's much stronger and different. And so those things took off. I want to keep talking about the role of foreign governments in this. We've seen in places like El Salvador that governments will actively work with and cooperate with cartels to limit crime, which, of course, under that umbrella is the trade of cocaine. Do you think this is a tactic that works well and other governments in Latin and South America should take? Or does this just empower the cartels to sort of regroup and come back?
It's a good question. Certainly the question of El Salvador is in Latin America, certainly in the Latin America I know, which is Colombia, parts of Central America, there is a constant talk of Bukele, because of what he's done. Now, we can get into what he's done in El Salvador, but in Colombia, there is a sense of frustration with the just staggering crime rates at this point. I mean, just mind-blowing. Colombia's always had a problem with criminality, and it's not just cartels. It's also just street muggings, violence. And now it just feels like anybody can be a victim in any moment. In Bogota, in Medellin, in Cali, it just feels like it's complete chaos out there. And that is people really demanding a firm hand. Some people really demanding. And the amount of times I've had conversations and within a minute or two, well, what we need here is the Bukele. And when I've been to El Salvador, I've been to El Salvador since this state of siege or exception. I can't remember what he calls it officially, but it is true that you can go to neighborhoods that have a night and day. I mean, I've been to a few of them. One of them is one that overlooks the city of San Salvador now. And the guy who was with me, who was telling me, look, you've got to be skeptical about what Bukele's done. But I'm telling you, if we had tried to come to this neighborhood 3 years ago, they would have killed me first. And if you're lucky, they would have told you to get out of here and go back home, if you're lucky. And now it was a place where people drove up and they had pupusas and sat and drank beers looking down. It's an overlook on the city. And he said this is time and time again. Of course, the problem is, are there people being swept up in these mass raids who are innocent? It seems to suggest there are. I think, though, that what I fear is, it's not what I fear. I think what I'm seeing, though, is a change in a philosophy and a change in approach to life, because people have been coarsened by the pandemic, by rising rates of crime. People are desperate. And I think certainly throughout my life, we've gone on the old basis of, what was it? Was it Abraham Lincoln said, better that 99 guilty men go free than one innocent man hang. Something like that, right? We all know what I'm referring to, right? I think people in Latin America are saying, why? Why? Why would 99 men go? They're starting to put that on trial. We're rethinking, and I think that's where we may be heading, because I think people are prepared to give up certain rights in order to feel safe. Whatever we think about that.
Yeah,
sorry,
no, I hate me to cut you off, just a lag, but it seems to me that people see conversations we have as sort of intellectual, academic, but not the reality on the ground when they know someone who was killed by MS-13. So those things don't matter if your basic hierarchy of needs aren't being met. But I would also say, I was in El Salvador about a year and a half ago, and I actually got lost wandering the streets of San Salvador at 3 a.m. and I hitchhiked and nothing happened. That was after Bukele had come into office, and had that happened 2 or 3 years before, probably could have been a much different result. So it does seem that there's a sense of security in a place like El Salvador now that doesn't exist with these mass roundups, though your concern is very well understood and well documented. We have seen a rise of other sort of right-wing politicians and authoritarians in Central America and in South America, from Bukele to Argentina, but just throughout the region. But we've also seen some progressive or seemingly progressive individuals, such as in Mexico, and you're talking about in Colombia, take office as well. How do we think their path will differ moving forward in fighting the cocaine fight?
That's a good question. The future of the fight against cocaine, just to step back, I was recently in Honduras, and Honduras really seems to be kind of stuck in the way El Salvador was. And that's where you see the real desperation. And I spoke to a number of people, and again, everybody there wants to talk about Bukele. And they just all laughed. They said, it just can't happen here. Here it's too corrupt. They've employed their own state of siege, but one of the people I was with said, no, what they did is they fired the honest police officers and kept the corrupt ones. I don't know if Latin America has any major plan to really tackle a new plan to tackle the war on drugs, or the cocaine industry. There has been, again, it is a historical moment that you do have these politicians in office like Petro, who's saying we need to change the war on drugs. Because what used to happen is, it used to be that every president would come out of office and then would announce, oh, by the way, guys, the war on drugs isn't working. Well, all right, take your Medal of Bravery right there for, saying it when it no longer mattered. But starting with Juan Manuel Santos, the president, he tried to get a global discussion going about this. He compared fighting the war on drugs, and the Colombians see fighting the war on drugs that no one has suffered more than them. They say, whatever the war on drugs is in your mind in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., London, in Colombia, it is genuinely a war. It's fought with attack helicopters, missile strikes, RPGs, sharpshooters. Yeah, it's a real war for cocaine in Colombia. So no one has suffered more than Colombia. And Juan Manuel Santos, the architect of that, the president who oversaw that peace process, said that he compared it to being on an exercise bike, that you get on, you move, you pedal as fast as you can, you sweat for half an hour, you get off, you haven't moved an inch forward. And that's what Colombians feel. So Petro was supposed to embody this chance of changing the war on drugs. The problem is he's got also bogged down in internal fights about the economy, political fights with the opposition. And the war on drugs has slightly kind of faded into the background as he's had to fight about pension renewal. He's the first left-wing president in Colombia's real history. So, imagine what his checklist of policies was going to be. So I don't think there's been the follow-up that perhaps a lot of people wanted to see. We know AMLO in Mexico, I think, was supportive of a rethinking of the war on drugs. But all of this, until the US signs off, no one can do anything. That's the reality of the situation. No one is going to risk becoming an overnight international pariah by legalizing cocaine. They can't. Many of them, most countries have signed on to these anti-drug treaties that mean they need to keep fighting the war on drugs. So it's hard to see. And I think about this when I compare it to the legalization of marijuana. And I think this is an interesting comparison. The legalization or the decriminalization, the legalization of marijuana, this was a 50, 60-year project. And you had people, like I remember, I grew up in the 80s. The punchline for any joke by sort of mainstream America was about the filthy hippie smoking marijuana. Just make fun. But the marijuana advocates like Willie Nelson took that, would be the butt of those jokes. And then they kept the torch going, even when it was the most unfashionable thing ever. They kept going. Then there was the whole medical marijuana. They kept fighting. They worked from grassroots organizations up to pressure local politicians. They got it taken care of in one county in Colorado, whatever. But you know what I mean? It was a whole mass movement. Where is that for these people who want to legalize drugs? Where is your celebrity who's out there who's saying, actually, you know what, cocaine doesn't do that much problem? Whatever. You know what I mean? Where is that? Where is that cultural shift? No, every legalizer of drugs who I've ever met just thinks, we've won the argument. The rest of you will catch up to us one day. Politics doesn't work that way. You've got to go out and do the politics. And I find the legalizers of drugs are absolutely incompetent when it comes to the politics. They think they've won the argument, therefore, well, that's it. It doesn't work that way. You've got to get out there. You've got to convince people. Because I have the test, which is just the next dinner party you're at, turn to your aunt and say, by the way, I think heroin ought to be available in CVS. See what she says. She's not ready for that conversation because no one's prepared her for that conversation. That is politics. Now, again, I'm agnostic about legalizing drugs. I don't know, I think, as I say, I think everyone has to kind of, rethink. But I don't know what else we can do either, because if we keep on this war on drugs, we keep condemning, especially these people in Latin America, to just this endless churn of dead bodies, just more dead young men and women in Colombia, Mexico, and it's heartbreaking.
You and I would love to wrap with this, but you're talking about the impact actually on the ground, and you tell a really vivid story about a man whose wife, I think, was sick, and he had just gotten out of prison for running drugs, but he had to afford her medication to keep her alive. So he took a job on a boat actually smuggling drugs out of Colombia. I do believe it was your book. Let's say we're sitting here in 10 years and we won the war, we made the problem significantly more manageable, or we're still stuck doing the same thing. If things have improved, what do you think would have happened between now and 2034? It's a broad question.
Things would, yeah. these are deep questions. I love it. I don't even know what success looks like anymore. Honestly, I mean, I think
have you
that
seen
there
it
would
in
be
Europe anywhere, or I think you reported in Syria too. Like, they had problems with opium. Have you seen a success in the drug fights?
My reporting in Syria, I was there for the fight for Aleppo. I was there for I wasn't there for any. I know they've got. I know the Syrians have got heavily involved in the drug trade recently, but I think the true question comes: why are we taking drugs? And I think it comes from different things. But I would like us to be much more curious about this, because I think there's an artistic temperament that is edgy, that seeks to experiment, that seeks to lose themselves in drugs. I think there's a despair component for other people that the reality is so bad. I've been struck by wandering around Washington, D.C., how many people in minimum wage jobs seem to be self-medicating with marijuana. I go past construction sites. I don't know if that's minimum wage. Sorry, that was a broad term. But Starbucks, my feeling is 1 in 4 of the people. I was in a good restaurant the other night having dinner with my father. I am sure our waitress was high. I don't have a problem with it, but I do note that if you're coming to work high, that's not, it would be like I see it as like coming to work drunk on whiskey. This isn't like get drunk on whiskey on Friday night. Cool, because it's a pleasure. Go have fun. But if you're getting drunk on whiskey Monday morning, maybe take a seat and let's talk about that. So I would be, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think that is that's a 5-hour conversation, not an hour-long conversation about why we're failing our citizens in the United States. Where, look, 1 in 3 people are on antidepressants and everyone's high on something all the time. Personally, I have nicotine all day, but why?
Exactly. I love nicotine. I was a heavy smoker, and people who never smoke never understand the pleasure of nicotine. And that was not, I didn't get into smoking out of despair or, oh, there you go. Yeah, we're on nicotine. Yeah, exactly. And nicotine is a fine, wonderful drug. I found it incredibly helpful to write. Yes. I was just smoking too much. I was smoking over a pack a day. That only ends one way. You know, Martin Amis, look at that. We lost him at 73 or something? Yeah. With the finest healthcare available to man. Christopher Hitchens. Yeah. All of these people. And I just didn't want to end up like that. But again, I see the role for people enjoying drugs on their own terms. You know, I think when you look at the people's use of things like ayahuasca, it can be tremendously helpful. There seems to have been something about treatment of PTSD for MDMA, but we don't need to just look at it for utilitarian reasons. Something can just be pleasurable of itself. But I do want to know it's being done for the best reasons and not out of despair. You know, we need to help our addicts. And I think if we can, and Colombia needs help eradicating corruption, but these can also seem like monumental tasks. You know, many people have come in promising to lower corruption in Colombia, but it just seems to still be there. And I don't know how, I don't know how you would lower that. Because I don't think, just take, for instance, now, Gustavo Petro. I do not believe Gustavo Petro is a corrupt man. I believe he's fought against corruption. Yet I don't think that his government is particularly winning the war on corruption. So when you have someone who's in office who's not corrupt, and even they are having trouble I don't know what hope there is. But, the one mortal sin is despair. So that's the one thing we can't allow ourselves, right?
That's right. Well, Toby, I am more than grateful for your time, and I don't want to keep you forever. But for our listeners, where can they find your work, and what are you working on now? And just thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, the conversation, and certainly you've asked me questions no one has ever asked before. So I love that.
It's mostly inspired by the nicotine we were talking about. So
oh, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, I need to get back on the nicotine as well. A lot of my work there is at my website, tobymuse.com. I am working on a documentary series now regarding adapting a friend of mine's book. And we're either going to make it into a documentary series, but we're in the first stages of that. And it really highlights one of the very magical realism moments of Colombia's recent civil war. An absolutely incredible story that I can't wait to share with the world. And hopefully that's going to go out on one of the larger streaming platforms. That's what the plan is.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker.
And I'm George Bogdan.
See you next time.